Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Atomic Podcast. I am extremely excited and honored to have Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. He is the J. Newton Razor Chair of Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, and a recent author of a book that I know we're going to talk about. If not the book, certainly the concepts, and it's called The Superhumanities. I think Jeff has done a remarkable job in contributing to our notion of human experience and phenomenology, but also the richness of our experience and the edges of that experience that often go uncaptured. Certainly, it goes uncaptured often in cognitive neuroscience and clearly in AI and computational forms. But I think we ourselves, as people, sort of on the streets in our lives, in our families, we don't acknowledge ourselves in a way how superhuman we actually are. So I wanna turn it over to Jeff. Thank you for being here on the Atomic Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Rodney. I'm happy to be here, really.
And could you give it like a kind of a good sense, a little bit of your background, but also your kind of journey into where superhumanities come from and why it's so urgent today?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can give you the quick version of that. I mean, um I grew up in Nebraska actually, and I wanted to be a monk. I was uber Catholic, as we say. And because of my seminary training, I got really interested in the comparative study of religion. And instead, I entered the academy and became a historian of religions, which is a particular school. History of religions is a particular school of comparison. I got really interested in India and Hinduism and Buddhism, and then eventually the human potential movement in California. That then took me to a real interest in the paranormal or people's extreme kind of excessive experiences that don't quite fit in. And I've been writing about those things really since 2010. So for about almost 14, 15 years now, I've been writing about these experiences, both in creators of popular culture, comic books, science fiction, movies, film, that kind of thing, but also more recently in the humanities or the academy itself. And the book you're talking about, which came out last year, it really comes out of 4 years working in a dean's office in a school of humanities. I was an associate dean for 4 years, and I saw the humanities both from the inside and from the outside, and quite intimately, and I think quite accurately. And it struck me over and over again that the people we read, the people we admire, came to their ideas through altered states. They did not think their way to them. They did not logically or rationally make these conclusions. They were essentially shown these things, or these things were revealed to them in altered states. And sometimes it's a near-death experience, sometimes it's a psychedelic state, sometimes it's a mystical experience, but there are all kinds of ways that human consciousness is altered. But I think those states are absolutely crucial to what we call the humanities, or the study of literature and history and philosophy and religion and art that exist in many of the universities. So my goal in writing that book is simply to say, we're weirder than you think we are. These strange states really matter. It's really what produce our best ideas. It's what produce the humanities. But the humanities also have this very intense, very honed and disciplined prophetic sense, I call it, this sort of moral or ethical concern around social systems and identity and gender and race and sexuality and sexual orientation. And so the superhumanities is very much all of that too, but it's also insisting that these superhuman states be left on the table and become a part of that. And looking in particular at where those two things come together, because a lot of times these altered states occur in moments of social transition and moral anxiety.
And are you saying that these altered states kind of collectively accelerate or become more numerous during states of social transition, or are they
Yes.
just more recognized,
Well,
or both?
probably the latter. They probably come to the fore and are more emphasized because the society is in such a state of transition. My own feeling is that these altered states are everywhere all the time. We're swimming in an ocean of extraordinary experience right now. Many of your listeners have had these states, but that we suppress them socially and culturally and certainly academically. We pretend they're rare. We pretend they don't matter, but in fact they do matter. And not only do they matter a great deal. They change lives and they change whole societies. And that's really what I want to say.
Yeah, and so in the Superhumanities, in the books and in the book, but also in your writings before the Superhumanities, you refer to Nietzsche fairly frequently, not in the, I'll say, in the bumper sticker way or in the way he's been used or appropriated, but in a way in which the superhuman comes forward, I think, as very aspirational and very grounded. Could you kind of speak to that notion that comes from Nietzsche and forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I never read Friedrich Nietzsche as a intellectual or as a graduate student. I was very much trained and read in Sigmund Freud and the whole psychoanalytic tradition, but I didn't read Nietzsche for whatever reason. I mean, you can't read everyone. But over the years, and by the years I mean the last 5 to 10 years, I've had a number of graduate students whose lives were completely changed, in one case saved, by reading this man. And I listened to those stories and I was like, wow, what is going on here? Who is this guy and what did he actually say? And so read I read Nietzsche. I did what professors were supposed to do. I actually read the person. And I was shocked actually by what I found, because I had grown up with the bumper sticker Nietzsche, the God is dead, everything sucks, be mean to each other kind of, Nietzsche. And it's just not what I found. It's not what I read. And when you actually read Nietzsche, what you discover is that there's a naysaying Nietzsche, there's a deconstructive or genealogical Nietzsche that's very powerful and very persuasive. But there's also this yay saying Nietzsche that's very affirmative and even claiming self deification and identifying with individuals like Dionysius and Zarathustra and the Buddha and the Christ and all these major sort of icons from human history. And the way that's usually read in the humanities is it's ignored. It's not read at all. It's like, oh, that's the crazy Nietzsche. That's, he's becoming, he's falling into his illness towards the end of his life. I'm like, no, that's actually Nietzsche. That's where he's getting these state. If you listen to him, he says very clearly that these things were revealed to him, and he uses the word revelation. He uses the German for uncanny, for preternatural. I mean, it's just all over the place. It's so obvious. And so I wanted to focus on both the naysaying, but also the yay-saying. And my argument in the book is, look, the humanities have become a naysaying set of disciplines. The truth must be depressing. We know how to take things apart, but we actually don't know how to put things back together. And we're not offering our publics or our students a positive, much less an ecstatic or a world-affirming message, which is what Nietzsche was doing, by the way. And his famous notion of the Übermensch, which became the Superman in American English, or the superhumans, probably a better translation, was definitely a part of this affirming vision. And he saw this in a kind of evolutionary perspective, that this is where the species was going. He claimed to have seen the superhumans. I mean, he uses that language. And I just was like, wow, not only did he initiate the whole language of the superhuman, but he also initiated these evolutionary esotericisms or spiritualities. And that, of course, gets all erased in this, God is dead, we suck, Nietzsche, which is what I think you grew up with, and probably what I grew up with. What I grew up with, and it just ain't so.
Yeah, I think there's one aspect. I mean, I came to Nietzsche really through Derrida
Yeah,
a little bit, but also read him pretty closely as well. But I always got the affirmative message for the most part. But I also got that how far we have to go to
Yeah.
get to that potential, and what we, some of the strategies to get there. But it was less about strategies. It was just a sense of almost mourning at first that we haven't captured that extraordinary in ourselves, and and then going forward from there.
Yeah, I think, and it's not just Nietzsche, by the way. I mean, the superhumanities involves everyone, not just this wild German philosopher, but he was really battling nihilism, and he felt that European society was nihilistic. It was going nowhere fast, and he talked about The Last Man, which was really this kind of depressed, over cultivated individual in Europe that just really had no real reason to live, and that's what he was trying to overcome, to use his own language, and that gets picked up, and so later writers like William James, for example, uses the word superhuman hundreds of times. And of course, that's never quoted. We just pretend he didn't say that. And we focus on James as a pragmatist or something. I don't know what we focus on. But in the meantime, he's sucking on nitrous oxide and he's like reading Hegel and talking about the superhuman. I'm like, whoa, just hold on a minute. First of all, where did he get that nitrous oxide? I really want to know that. And why is he sucking on it? And of course, he's doing that to alter his mind and to have these thoughts.
I want to come at this incredible vision that you're painting through different authors, but your work and your own vision, and that is this: what is the consequence of kind of the opposite, which is a culture that is very material based, materialistic, but also just materiality based, reductionist. And if we kind of stay, I'll put it in a kind of engineering culture framework, what do we lose?
I think we lose ourselves. I think we lose the human spirit, or what we call the human spirit, or the soul, as we used to call it. Um, I mean, I think engineering and science, STEM as we call it in the university, is really important and really powerful, but it doesn't provide meaning. It doesn't answer the question of why. It answers the questions of how do we make food cold, or how do we fly from here to there, but not why the hell do we exist at all? Why is there a Rodney or a Jeff at all? And those deeper questions, I think, are precisely the questions that the superhumanities can address quite directly, and will give different answers. By the way, I'm not proposing a particular answer. I'm just saying, look, those are questions that people are asking, whether we acknowledge it or not. Our students are asking those questions in the classroom. And if we don't address them, guess what? Someone else will, and probably badly. And so I just want us to keep asking those questions. So to answer your question, I don't think engineering or science gets us to the question of meaning, or why we live, or why we get up in the morning. It basically just can make cool stuff, which is cool, right? But my joke is, we can make refrigerators, therefore materialism is true. It doesn't follow at all. But that's, I think, what people conclude, that because something is pragmatic and useful, it's one interpretation of it, therefore must be the case. And if everything is just matter, and matter is dead or insentient, which is what materialism states at the end of the day, I think things are pretty bleak, pretty darn depressing. But they're not depressing, and that's sort of the message of the book, I think.
Yeah, whenever I see a book such as yours, and there's not a lot of them, and I don't mean just in terms of content or in terms of what it is that you're saying regarding consciousness, but it's timeliness. So your book is also part of that social transition that you mentioned.
Yes,
So that
I hope.
there's, yeah, but I mean, these ideas that crystallize around and circle and come out of the superhumanities as a concept, I think is really important. And I'm just curious if you see that people find your book timely, or the ideas kind of essential one, to their life, but two, perhaps to their research and the way they view, you know, they view the world?
I don't know. I think it depends. I'll give you an optimistic
Or
answer
do
and
they push back?
yeah,
That's also
I'll give you a pessimistic answer and an optimistic answer. I mean,
okay.
the pessimistic answer is I'm not sure people read anymore. Um, and I think that's a horrible problem, actually. I think social media has devastated reading practices in a profoundly bad way. And I say that about myself, as well as I say that about my students. So that's the pessimistic answer. The optimistic answer is, people ask me all the time, well, how do you deal with all the pushback? And my reply is always, what pushback? If you really talk to intellectuals who I think are real intellectuals now, people who really question their own categories, they'll often say things like, well, that happened to me once, or that happened to my mother, or that happened to my brother, or I've heard those stories, absolutely. But they don't want to step out of the closet, as it were, and say those things on stage because they're afraid that their reputation will be tarnished if they do. But so they're happy with me doing that. I mean, I'm the weird, religion professor. I let Mikey, the old commercial, let Mikey eat it. Mikey will eat anything. And that's kind of their attitude, I think. But they're not resistant. They just don't have a model to make this stuff possible and make it meaningful and put it into a larger moral and political and metaphysical context. And so that's what I try to do. I try to provide a larger context in which these things can be seriously talked about. Because the other thing I really learned in the dean's office is nothing's going to work unless we do it intergenerationally. It can't be about Jeff. It can't be about Rodney, because Rodney and Jeff, we're going to go away. We're going to die. And so it has to be, I mean, this is where the sciences are so smart and so good. They've learned that there's this intergenerational thing, that the science evolves and moves forward despite the silliness and the dogmatisms of individual scientists. It doesn't matter. It's the science that matters. And I think that's where we got to get with a lot of this stuff. We have to integrate this right into the gut of the humanities and let them forward them from generation to generation. And then I think we can make some real progress.
Could you explain a little further, or perhaps dig in more, the idea of superhumanities, the super aspect of the humanities that you're seeing moving forward? You've been referring to it.
Yeah. So by the super or the superhuman, I simply mean those aspects of human experience that are quite common, but are denied or not talked about because they're considered impossible. And my argument is that, look, the impossible is just a function of your assumptions. It's actually not a function of reality. Reality is really, really weird and strange. And you just keep telling it what it can do and can't do because of your own assumptions. So things like people have precognitive dreams all the time. They dream in perfect detail what's going to happen the next day, and they're spot on, or people know instantly when a loved one died, and it might be thousands of miles away, and they know instantly. Well, how do they know that? So that to me requires a different model of what a human being is, a kind of superhuman model, so that we can take those things in and not keep saying that they don't happen. And that's before really strange things, Rodney. I mean, it gets really weird. People see other beings and they see telepathic, praying mantises, and they, I mean, it gets really weird really fast. And my message is, look, don't take any of that off the table. Keep it all on the table, because that's exactly what a human being is. That's what the human being's telling you. And let's think with it, because it's obviously trying to get our attention. That's why it appeared. That's why the precognitive dream happened. That's why the telepathic knowledge of the death of a loved one happened. That's why the apparition happened. That's why the near-death experience happened. That's why the psychedelic state of deification, where you become one with everything, that's why it happens. It's trying to get us to think and get us to change our worldview. And so that's what I mean by the superhuman. I mean any kind of state of mind or body or embodiment that exceeds that which we think is possible, or which we think is, I guess, human. I mean, when people say the human, they usually mean something really banal, right? Really social and embodied and material. And it's pretty depressing at the end of the day. And the superhuman is that which exceeds that, and that which we share, by the way, as well. There's no boundaries or borders on this.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because I'll just pair this conversation quickly with a conversation I had yesterday with a group of cognitive neuroscientists. They said that neuroscience has cognitive neuroscience is the neck up, and it's really the neck down. And this group goes, we're the neck down. We're the embodied researchers that are looking at the weird and strange. So I think,
well, but they're just still in the body. My reply would be, yeah, but you're still in the body. I mean,
I know, no, but they're also doing telepathy and things like that. But
okay.
yeah, I think one leads to the other. I think once you get out of the idea that everything happens in the skull,
Yeah,
you start to move through the body into a much more, we can call it from an AI standpoint, a kind of network, but also a much more shareable approach to
yeah.
consciousness.
Well,
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I've learned over the years about these extraordinary experiences, is that they're often deeply emotional and social. They don't happen between strangers, or they tend not to. They tend to happen between people who are deeply entangled in a very emotional and often very loving way, or complicated ways. You don't know when the stranger dies, but you know when your dad dies. So it's that kind of thing. And it also involves trauma, frankly. I think trauma is really important. It can be sexual trauma, it can be physical trauma, it can be emotional, it can be a lot of different kinds of trauma, but you don't get these experiences without the trauma in most situations. And I think this is what's fundamentally mistaken about the debunking claim. Oh, these things don't happen in a laboratory. I'm like, of course they don't. What Why would they? You're not traumatizing anybody. And even if you do traumatize people, it may not happen. So no, don't traumatize people. I'm not proposing, that you ignore your IRB at your university, but I'm saying people have near-death experiences when they're about almost dead. I mean, come on. I mean, by definition, it's a physical trauma. And then you put people in a room in a laboratory and you bore the shit out of them, and you're like, nothing is happening. Of course, nothing is happening, because there's no trauma. There's nobody's in a car accident. So to me, it's just it's funny, but it's also kind of pathetic and ridiculous. Um,
How is acknowledging these key experiences um, going to be, let's say, pushing the intergenerational superhumanities forward? How can we, I'll say we, meaning myself and others listening to you, how do we push forward a kind of new, I'll say, breed or new aspect of the humanities? Because we all, I tend to read, so I'm still, I guess, ancient
good,
here. Uh,
good for
uh,
you.
yeah, but the idea is that I still can be transformed by what I read.
Yeah.
I'll say it with a small t, but I still often can find ideas and friends and books that I can't find in the world. So the idea here is that how do we move the superhumanities forward, and in what ways do we move that forward, and how do we know anything's even moving forward
Well,
if we're
so
not in academia? Let me say that
okay.
piece.
Well, if we're not in academia, and I'm not, the Superhumanities is a very nerdy book, right? It's really it's an academic kind of argument. But I don't romanticize the academy, Rodney. I don't think that only academics have these kinds of experiences. I think they happen to everyone, actually, or all kinds of people. So if you're not an academic, how do you push forward the superhumanities? You insist that people talk about these things, and you don't let your doctor or your pastor or your whatever social authority you have, you don't let them off the hook when these things happen. You're like, no, talk about this, think about it. So the superhumanities are really just about keeping everything on the table and not taking things off the table that you don't like or don't fit into your worldview. I think that's really the kind of the ultimate message. I'll give you a good example of a real world one. So I co-wrote a book years ago called Change in a Flash with a woman named Elizabeth Crone. And she was struck by lightning in the parking lot of her synagogue. And her rabbis wouldn't talk about it. uh, you know, and she was like, what? I mean, I just talked to God and I went to heaven and you're not going to talk about this? I mean she was really and she but the Orthodox rabbis would talk about it. But then she didn't like the Orthodox kosher laws and purity codes and things. And so what Elizabeth did, well, for 30 years she did nothing. She kept it all to herself until she met me, and I was like, Elizabeth, come on, you gotta talk. And then she wrote a book, and now she's talking in public about this. But that's what the Superhumanities is. It's talking in public to other people and other friends about what actually happened and not letting them off the hook. And what Elizabeth said to me, she says, well, Jeff, if I talk about this, I'm going to lose some friends. And I was like, oh yeah, you're going to lose some friends. But you're also going to gain some friends. You're going to gain some people who want to talk about this. So I think that's what the superhumanities are: is that reshuffling of one's social networks around these kinds of experiences.
It's also about transformation, correct?
I
It's also about, yeah, go ahead.
Well, what do you mean by that? I mean, obviously it does. It's all about transformation.
Yeah, it's all about, but I mean, because there's this kind of social dimension, even academic or structural dimension, in which the academy can be changed. But there's also this very personal dimension. So it's sort of touching different levels.
Well, okay, so one of the things that I've written a lot about is popular culture. I mean, hence Iron Man in the background there, right? Um, Popular culture, television, film is actually really good at the superhuman. It's really comfortable with it. It portrays it a lot. But I think we allow ourselves to do this in the entertainment world because we can always tell ourselves, oh, it's just a film or it's just a movie. We let ourselves off the hook. And I'm like, no, don't don't let yourself off the hook. Talk, let's get the politicians talking about this. Let's get the religious leaders talking about it. Let's get the professor. Let's get everybody really on board talking about this so that we can move this thing forward as a public again and as a culture. And I think that's what the superhumanities. That's why I so believe in the academy still, is because it's a way to mainstream this stuff. I mean, look, I I pass this thing on to young people every time I am in a classroom, sometimes hundreds of young people. Okay. And parents send their young people to a university to be educated, yes, but they also end up being transformed by what happens in that classroom. So I think the classroom is just one social space where this can happen. But I think it can happen in churches. I think it can happen in synagogues and temples. I think it can happen at the movie theater. It can happen anywhere, and it does. So that's my longer answer. I don't want to be. I am a nerd at the end of the day. I'm a professor. I read books. I talk about books, but I don't think this is ultimately a nerdy kind of argument.
It's not. To me, it's very flesh and bones, but it's also, to me, it's of the street. It's gritty, but it's
Yeah.
also something that's very much expansive. It's like there are 80% of ourselves, our consciousness, that happen, and we don't pay attention to it. That's kind of the way I'm seeing. There are certain black boxes in the way that we have consciousness and experience consciousness that we're not acknowledging. I'll share with you a little this. a tweet that really set me off. And I briefly wrote about it, but it was an engineer that said, now that we have ChatGPT or any of the foundation models, that now we can write better than we ever did before. So now people in philosophy and history and so forth can get a real job. That can become useful and become an engineer. So I know that's all kind of offensive and weird and actually typical. But it set me off because of the clarity of where this person was coming from, that writing and literature could be done elsewhere, and therefore we can all now be useful if we become engineers. So the idea of usefulness has pervaded the culture to such a deep degree that it is not so much the why, it's so much about the how, and the how is pretty much about coding and engineering and science. And I'm from the sciences and also from AI. So this is, I think you build super bad systems if you're not acknowledging these corners of your own mind, of your own experience. And we see a lot of that happening.
Yeah, I mean, was that a question? I mean, I
No,
think I
it's
agree
just
with
like
it.
I thought it was, but then I just got going. So I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I'm just
no, it's
sorry, Jeff.
fine. I mean, but one of my thoughts listening to you is, well, the Chat GPT, they're using our stuff. I mean, we wrote all that stuff that they're coming up with and just regurgitating, and often really bad ways, by the way. Not always, but often.
Yeah, and so you're, thinking about your teaching and also your kind of integration of different experiences, whether they're, near death, psychedelic, spiritual. Those experiences are really what you're kind of asking your students to do, is to kind of think about what their life going forward will be like if they live this kind of life.
Yeah,
uh, and this kind of like, it's, you're giving them a kind of model and affirmation to, I think,
but
maybe
also,
affirmation.
yeah, but also those young people are asking those questions in their head. They're human beings too, and they can see right through the it's all about usefulness, or it's all about monetization, or it's all about some career. No, it's actually not. And they know that from the bottom of their brains and their hearts and their bodies, when they're 18. So heaven only knows what they'll know when they're 40. And so there's that. I mean, basically, I think what I'm trying to say is that we're very much about helping people articulate what their own questions are, and their own questions far exceed these engineering questions, which are important, but are certainly limited and simply not adequate.
Not adequate, yeah. And I think, Jeff, another question, if I could throw this at you, is how do you see your colleagues moving forward, both in the history of religion and philosophy, with these concepts of the superhuman? Are they, are, are they colleagues kind of in arms? Are they colleagues kind of in pushback, or are you seeing people kind of getting it? If you know what I mean, getting your message.
Well, again, it's kind of like, what pushback are you talking about? I mean, of course, there's pushback, and I don't want to pretend, and I say this in the book, I don't want to pretend that this is what the humanities are in the universities and colleges. It's not. They're simply not there. But my argument is, well, this is the history of the humanities, is the superhumanities, whether you acknowledge this or not. That's your history. Um, and at the moment, we're not in that place for sure. We're more on the prophetic side of the table, which I think is probably where we should be. And I understand that, and I'm fine with that. But this longer picture, this bigger picture, includes the prophetic, but also includes the superhuman. So I don't think we're there, and I think this is a fairly heterodox position. But I will say, when I talk about these things at conferences and at other universities, there's a lot of support, and there's a lot of people wanting to do this, Rodney. It's not just Jeff. It's not just weird Jeff. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of humanists who really want to talk about these things and really want to do this. And really what the book is trying to do is just authorize that, just create a space, create a book you can cite and go for it. Go do it, you know? And I keep telling people it's not the superhumanities isn't a particular position or interpretation. It's the conversation. It's the debate around this thing. Are there problems with Friedrich Nietzsche? Absolutely. Are there problems with William James? Absolutely. Are there problems with Gloria Anzaldúa? Absolutely. But let's talk about them and let's include these altered states in the conversation and not keep pretending that they aren't important when they clearly are.
I wanted to understand a little better because I believe you are chairman of the board at Esalen. I don't know if you still are.
So I was. I'm no longer, but I'm on
Okay,
the
but you
I'm
have
on the
been.
board. I'm on the
Okay,
board.
okay, so you're on the board. So from the context of your work at Rice to the context of your work at Esalen, how do you see that work and the understanding of, let's say, the superhuman in this case, sort of translating across those environments?
Well,
Or
it certainly translates across my own person. I mean, you know, one of the things. Well, first of all, Esalen is a retreat center in Big Sur, California. We should probably say what it is.
yes,
And but there are different Eselens, and I'm not involved in the public programming of Esalen, which is what most people know. I'm involved in something called the Center for Theory and Research, which is essentially the think tank or the research arm of the institute. And one of the things we say a lot is what CTR is about are talking about things that can't be talked about in the university or the churches. And you know, that's just now we'd say the religious institutions. Okay, we'd broaden it, but we're trying to address human potentials that cannot be generally talked about in academic circles or religious circles. And so this notion of the superhumanities is it's pure Esalen in some way. But what I'm trying to say is, look, the humanities themselves have always been pure Esalen. They've always been about human potential. Here's the language they use, and here's what they've done. But it is very much related to this. And sometimes there's direct overlap. So someone like Aldous Huxley, for example, is a perfect example of someone who's read all over the place, but we only read his dystopian novel, Brave New World. We don't read his utopian novel, which is actually what he thought, by the way. It's called Island. Nobody's heard of it. Nobody's read it because we just want to pretend that Aldous Huxley was this depressed, sarcastic, angry British person who wrote Brave New World. No, he wasn't. He was turned on by mescaline in 1954, and he thought the consciousness was cosmic and that the human being wasn't at all what we thought it was. And he said all of that in 1962 in Island, or 61 or 61, I guess, in Island. So that's what I'm talking about, is that's the superhumanities. It's Aldous Huxley was not just Brave New World. He was also Island. He was also the perennial philosophy. He was also the later things he wrote, you know, as well.
this a bit becomes. I'm sorry, I'm asking you these kind of big bucket questions, but maybe I can ask you at least another one. So, you know, I've been through my my PhD and been through academia, and I I really honor academic education. By the way,
Yeah,
I think
so do I.
it's super important.
Yeah.
All kinds of flaws and all that, but it's the institution is something that we don't need to get rid of. We just need to improve.
I
Um,
agree. That's
yeah, and so you know, as you were the dean, I've been in dean's offices, in and out of dean's offices. I know that sort of traffic and administrative decisions and good and bad days. Not quite like I'm sure you did, but the idea is this: is that how what are the key barriers that you see in the way people are educated, or at least some of your students, to keep them from acknowledging this wider one experience, but taking this wider experience into either a career or their personal life? You know, what is the fear factor there, or what are the cultural barriers that keep people one step or maybe two steps back from from acting on the very things that they already know and see.
Yeah. So maybe my time as an associate dean isn't directly relevant here, but it kind of is. What's really relevant though is my training of doctoral students. I mean, I train PhDs myself, and I talk about this in the book. By the way, this is the Superman stuff. They come to me and they basically want to be Professor Paranormal, and I'm like, no, you can't do that. You can certainly. I hope you have those interests. I hope you have those obsessions, but Superman never gets a job ever. Only Clark Kent gets a job. Only Clark Kent gets to go to the Daily Planet and write boring shit for this newspaper. So you've got to learn how to be Clark Kent, and then you can go into a phone booth and become Superman, and then you can come back and be Clark Kent. And you can go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's that back and forth that I'm trying to encourage them to do. It's not just be Superman or just be Clark Kent, because the truth is we're mostly Clark Kent in a day-to-day way. And I know that's a gendered kind of male kind of parable, but it works. It works because people know it. And so to answer your question, I think the main hurdle here is one of the reward system we use. We reward people for essentially being depressing, and we punish people for being ecstatic or enthusiastic or much less cosmic about something. Um, and I think that is a real problem. And I think what we have to do in our institutions of higher learning is we have to figure out a way to reward the positive vision and not just the negative critique. I think the negative critique is really important. We never want to stop doing that. But we also have to reward and hire for the positive vision. And as humanists, Rodney, and I'm speaking as one now, we have to develop a positive vision, and we have to be able to explain ourselves to the public. We have done a very poor job of that. In fact, I think if you ask most professors of the humanities what the humanities are, they would just look at you like, oh. What? I don't know. Okay, well, the book tries to explain what they are, and I think in a very accessible way, actually. And the story I tell in the book, which I think is worth telling here, is no kid grows up saying, I want to be a professor of the humanities, right? Have you ever met such a kid? It's a weird kid. If the kid says that, something's wrong with the kid, okay? But if we started calling these the superhumanities, every other kid in the world would want to grow up to be a superhuman. I mean, we just had Halloween, and I'm telling you, 2/3 of the kids were dressed up as superhumans. I mean, we have the imagination to do this. We have the ability to do this, but we do not have the language, and we're blowing it. We're just blowing it, I think. And so the book is like, come on, folks, stop blowing it. Do this. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
I think that I'll share, I think, a bias. And the bias is that when you're very affirmative or positive and you have a positive point of view towards the future, you're seen as less rigorous.
Of course you are. That's the
Yeah,
bias. I get that.
yeah, yeah,
That's definitely the bias.
yeah. And so the idea of possibility has an inherent sort of, uh, uh, you know, limp arm or limp leg, because and yet there's futurists all over the place. The problem with futurists are they're always, for the most part, technology driven.
Yeah.
So there's an industrial sort of incentive to see a world in which more things can be built.
Yeah.
I
Well, again, I'm not arguing that humanists should stop being critical of society or social assumptions. Not quite the contrary. I think the superhuman often arises within trauma and within profound social change. I want to link those things, and I want us to do both. I don't want us to do one or the other.
Yes, understood. One thing, I'll share an observation across kind of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, is that they all, to some degree, were also pushing back on the machines of their era. call it the factory, call it the psyche, call it, but the mechanization of certain processes, they all had a visceral reaction, if not trying to incorporate it into their theories. And I think we're at that social point too, particularly in our conversation with what does the machine mean in our life? And how do we actually push back or at least live with and expand our own world as the machine is expanding, it's being expanded in terms of its presence. And I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but I'm just giving you a statement of kind of observation.
I think I think about it all the time. I mean, we're on a machine right now. We're
Right.
looking at a screen right on our laptop. I think it's just it's a simple flip, and it's to see the machine as us. We made the machine. It's and this is what drives me nuts about this machine language. Is it's as if these machines can somehow be intelligent without us, or be. I mean, no, they're manifestations of us. So I think this rejection of the machine isn't really a rejection of the machine. It's a rejection of the independent machine, I think, is really what's going on. And I think we have to shift our view of technology into a much more humanistic kind of understanding of what technology is. It's not that we stop doing technology. That's silly, right? But it's that we understand what we're doing in a fundamentally different way. So that would be my answer. And a lot of people do write on spiritual machines, machine
Yes.
intelligence, spirituality. I mean, this isn't just me blabbing. I mean, there's a large literature on this that I, as you know, probably better than I do, is quite developed. But again, you have to read it. You have to like talk about it. You have to teach it. It has to enter the culture somehow.
Exactly. I don't know if you know the writings of Jerome Lanier, but he's a really profound humanist, and he was one of the founders of virtual reality. But there's a lot of people like him that are highly critical, at the same time keeping the human at the center of what we build and why we build it.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned, I don't know if you're willing to share, but you mentioned something kind of in your early digital experiences uh, that perhaps was formative, but also kind of pushed you along in how you interacted with digital um, machines or algorithms and so forth. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's relevant here. My early career was a career of being censored and being banned and being hated for what I thought and for what I wrote. And I tried to engage these haters. And what I found over and over again, which fascinated me on a kind of perverse level, it's what I call the Jekyll and Hyde phenomenon. That these individuals were quite civil and sometimes even friendly in person, but they were absolute monsters online and on the internet. And I found that division between their face-to-face persons and their online presence troubling. And I also saw that the online stuff was being used in a kind of algorithmic, kind of automatic, computer sciencey way that was very disturbing to me and absolutely had nothing to do with what I had said or thought. Um, and I'll tell you another factoid here that's really interesting. There are two, or there were, I don't know if it's still the case, but in the 1980s and 90s, it was often said that there were two professions from which fundamentalist leaders came from all over the world, by the way, in any religion. And those two professions were engineering and computer science. And think about that. Just think about that. And if you're in the gut of being on the hated end of the spectrum, it makes a total sense. It just makes instant sense that these are people who cannot think in terms of ambiguity and complexity, that a text, a scriptural text might mean a dozen things at the same time, maybe 100 things. You know, if the bridge is going to stay up or the computer code's going to work, it can only mean one thing. You can't have an angle that is at 12 different angles. You can't have code that means four different things. It won't run. So you can see why fundamentalism as a religious orientation comes from these very literalist very engineering-like professions, and you can see why humanists are very wary of some of these disciplines because of the way they train the mind, and the way they shape human beings.
And the way they shape the future.
It's yes. And so I'm suspicious. For me, the internet was a portal of hatred, Rodney, in the 1990s. I absolutely did not trust it. And I certainly, every time I get an email or a communication from someone I don't know if it's that person. I'd You show me something on YouTube, so what? You can put you can create anything now on YouTube with a special effect. I I just have nothing but suspicion for these algorithms and these online claims. Um, but I don't have that kind of suspicion when it comes down to students and sitting face to face with someone and talking through an issue, because I can see the person and I can see them react to different things, and I can, go to sources and I can check things, and I can teach people how to think critically and not how to just believe whatever they see or read.
And that critical thinking that one you encourage, but so many people encourage in the academy, is something that students carry with them as they go on to their lives. But it's something that they carry when they examine themselves. And I think that is partly what you're saying in the superhumanities. Is it's an outward critical thinking, but it's an inward critical thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote this little book called The Flip, and
Yes.
this is basically the argument. The argument is, don't think your thoughts, certainly don't believe your beliefs, be suspicious of yourself. And that ability to step outside of oneself and to look back on the self is the core skill of critical thinking. And certainly in the humanities, is how do I think critically of my own worldview, of my own values, of my own family, of my own religion, of my own culture? How do I not assume any of that, and then try to understand other people and where they're coming from as well? So one of the things is, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I'll often say to my graduate students, you don't have any business being a scholar of religion until you've lost at least two worlds. And they look at me and they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if you didn't ever lose a world, you still think your own cultural world somehow has the answers. And it doesn't. I guarantee it doesn't. And if you've only lost that world, chances are very high you've just stepped into another world. And that world might be engineering, by the way. It might be physics or chemistry or whatever it is. But when you've lost that second world, you're going to think twice about just jumping into another third world. You're going to step back and you're going to go, wait a minute. Maybe all of these worldviews or all of these systems are helpful in some ways and not helpful in other ways. And maybe there is no one single answer to everything. And it's at that moment you become, I think, a real intellectual, or you become a real thinker, because you have this ability to step out of your own assumptions. And that's certainly what I'm trying to argue for in my books. But I think that's what a lot of humanists are doing as well. When they walk into the classroom, they're trying to get their students to think in a similar kind of way.
Yeah, uh, to be a humanist today, say on my side in AI, in your side in philosophy and history of religions, and is sometimes it is a tough road. And I
I'll
don't.
bet. I'll bet.
And it's one of the reasons for this podcast, and certainly the reason that we're talking, is that you have to build something when it comes to the superhumanities, but just with other fellow humanists. Do you exist? Oh my God, you exist, and there's another one that exists, and I think this ability to connect is one of the positive things that comes out of the pandemic, comes out of online culture, is if we can connect and actually in a meaningful way, we can build community, as opposed to just getting another commentary, a thumbs up or thumbs down. which is like 90% of the day. So,
we're liked, you know.
oh my goodness, oh my goodness. So maybe I can ask you like a final question, or maybe you can leave the audience with a final thought on where kind of some of your future work or kind of direction of thinking is headed.
Yeah. I mean, I have a book coming out in the summer called How to Think Impossibly. And it really does sum up kind of where I'm at. It's an attempt to say, okay, so how do we do this? How how do we take people's experiences, which are bizarre and absurd sometimes? How do we take them seriously without taking them literally? In other words, how do we think impossibly? How do we take the impossible into our possibility, as it were? And so I think that's kind of really where I'm heading. And I think there are ways to do that, by the way. Um, and I think to go back to the sciences and the engineering, I think they're going to be part of this equation, but they're only going to be a part of it. They're not going to be the whole thing. And I think that's where I really differ with people. I think people want to say, or they want to imply, well, we'll just do more science and we'll figure this out. You know, science is the only way to know anything that's worth knowing. I'm like, that's not true. That's just dumb. That's just dumb. And you're not going to figure it out with more science. More science is never going to get the answer you're looking for, because this is not a scientific question to begin with. So I think that's where I'm headed, and also to a larger project of trying to integrate the sciences, particularly physics and evolutionary biology and cosmology, into people's spiritual lives and into these broader kind of extraordinary experiences that people are having. And they're no longer, by the way, going to hell or heaven or purgatory or seeing the Blessed Virgin Mary. They're going into another dimension, or they're experiencing the quantum level, or they're going into outer space. They're integrating the sciences. Whether the sciences like what they're doing or not is kind of beside the point. But that's what's happening on a very personal level, and I think that's what's happening in our movies and on our television set as well. And so that's really what I'm interested in.
I can't wait to read the book. I
Oh,
mean, I will read the book.
good. You really read. Good for you. And I, reading for me, by the way, it's not a mechanical thing. It's really weird. And one of the arguments I've made is that when people have a paranormal experience, it's often set up like a language. You experience something, you experience the world speaking to you in a particular kind of language, and then you language it back. And so reading and writing is part of this languaging system. And so when I talk about writing for myself, or I talk about you reading, I'm not talking about sitting down and parsing sentences and grammar and all. I'm talking about really transformative kind of spiritual practice that I think is fantastically underestimated today. I think we've almost lost that, but not quite. We haven't quite lost it. We're still publishing and reading books, thank goodness. But maybe not on this level I'm talking about.
Jeff, I can't thank you enough for the conversation, and I can't thank you enough for your work, and I can't also thank you enough for the kind of battles that you're fighting for yourself, for your
Yeah.
students, and actually for all of us in terms of spirit and consciousness. And you know, it's not just important work. I want to call it super work just to be funny, but it's essential work. So thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you. I do feel like we're all kind of nodes of this larger social cultural project, and that when someone like myself is trying to push back on something, it's really the culture pushing back on the culture. I feel like a kind of warning system, or a blinking red light, but I only blink because of this culture and this language and the way I mean, I'm very indebted to all the people whom I read, and who raised me. And it's not I don't subscribe to the independent kind of hero story. I think we're really nodes of this process, and I appreciate what you're saying, but it's really all of us. Um, and my joke is when people say things like that, I always look behind me like, who are they talking to? I mean, it's certainly not this dingbat, but I do hear you, and I've learned to sit with that, and I appreciate you saying that.
Well, thanks again, Jeff, and hopefully we can have another conversation kind of around some of the issues of, I'll say, spirituality and consciousness and AI and some of the fundamentalisms that you brought up.
Yeah, let's do that. I would like that, actually.
Yeah, we definitely will. Thank you, Jeff, and take good care.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, bye-bye.